Hello, everyone.
Hello. I hope everybody is ready for a great April Quilts First. Bill had his second vaccine this morning, so we're hoping he's going to hang in.
I won't just fall asleep in the middle of this.
That's right. We hope.
But I'm really relieved, and I hope many of you are able to get vaccinated as soon as you can.
All of you. We hope all of you.
All of you, yeah.
For sure.
And
we're going to discuss piecing today. And for those of you who can join us for the whole time, please do. Otherwise, we'll have it available on Facebook, this page, and our YouTube channel.
Yeah, it takes us a little bit to get it up on the YouTube, but we'll get it there.
So let us know if you've joined us so far, and we're going to get talking on piecing.
Today.
Yes,
there's
absolutely.
a lot to cover. And
so we have some examples here too as well to give you and a whole series of questions. So let's see, we'll wait and see whether anybody's going to join us or not.
Yeah, it always takes a moment for people to filter in. So we don't want to get too deep into things. Let's just see.
Okay, so let's get started with some of the questions that we've gotten.
That's a good way to do it.
And we'll see who joins us. Oh, good. Okay, so Karen can see us from Hudson. Good.
See,
all right.
It's always really, thank you, Karen.
We just need that first person. Like, are we going? Is this live? Okay. So I'm going to just run through some questions that people left for us on social media. Vicky wanted to know about piecing with looser weave fabrics.
I actually pulled out an example of that right away at the top.
Okay, so you can go ahead and start answering that. I'm going to grab the best press too.
So when you're looking on screen, this is going to look like just a regular solid quilt. This is actually our kids play quilt that is in Modern Quilts Illustrated number 6. It's on the cover of number 6. And this looks like regular solids. However, they were a loose weave, kind of a nubby solid that looks a little bit like linen. The threads that make up the cotton aren't equally thin. So they're very nubby. And what that leads to is a slightly looser weave. I mean, it's beautiful fabric. But the reality is, as soon as you have a looser weave or a coarser weave, the threads don't tend to hold each other quite as tightly, and raveling is more commonplace. And raveling can be frustrating. So there are a couple things that when we made this quilt that we did. One is, if you know you have a looser weave, pre-wash and pre-dry if you can. We do that with all of our fabrics. However, pre-washing and drying when possible locks those fibers tighter together.
Because it shrinks it. Basically, that's part of it.
It shrinks it, and it almost kind of felts it at a very, very micro scale. So pre-washing and pre-drying will always help minimize raveling. Some fabrics may still ravel somewhat afterwards. And so when we're thinking about fabric selection for a quilt, if we have a loose weave like this, we avoid really small pieces because those will be a bit less manageable. This, you can tell, they're big chunky pieces, so it works well even with a bit of raveling. And Weeks, you just picked up one of our favorites.
But we're talking about piecing.
Right. But this is leading to when you cut them and then you have to piece them. I mean, the piecing, the preparation is important.
Right. Best press, we don't have any gig with Mary Ellen's best press, but we love especially this scent-free one. But I also think you cannot underestimate the value of a good steam iron.
Yes.
That a good steam iron keeps everything flat and everything easier to cut, and it's much more manageable. So pre-wash, pre-dry, best press and a really good steam iron.
And minimize how much you have to handle it. So
Yes.
when we're talking about piecing, with a quilt like this, we will probably cut, if we have an hour to piece, we will cut what we need for that hour. And maybe, or we'll do all the cutting and set it in perfect piles where we can leave it untouched until we get to it. Because if you have to keep moving things around, you're going to get a little more opportunity for fraying. So minimize that.
Yep. Oh, it looks like lots of people have joined us, including Mary from Southwest Michigan, where it's snowing right now.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. And we've got some of our Canadian friends, and great to see everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. We're just getting started talking about, Santa Fe.
Another Hudson,
great.
great.
Yes.
Okay, we're all here.
Okay. So, we have so many, we may end up having to do 2 months worth of this because there's so many questions about piecing. But Karen on, I think Facebook or may have been Instagram, asked about piecing with seams pressed open.
Okay.
So I found these two kind of orphan blocks left over from, I think this was teaching somebody how to piece seams or circles.
Curves.
But what I want to show you, and again, I always have to.
I know where this is going.
It's now just become like a joke that one woman commented on our YouTube channel that I was crushing quilters' dreams by suggesting they shouldn't stitch in the ditch. So, at the risk of crushing your dreams, your quilting dreams, by showing our pressed open seams, again, you do whatever you want. It's your quilt. We're not like zealots,
Yeah,
we're not conversion zealots at
We're
cult.
going to show you
what we do
and explain why we do it so you can decide whether it's for you or not.
And you don't have to tell us that our method doesn't work for you. That you can just ignore it. Feel free. Keep scrolling, whatever works for you. But so these are two backsides of curved pieces press open. And this is what we like about piecing with seams pressed open. Okay, so I'm going to take the pin, backwards, and I'm going to put it 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge.
So this is so important. She didn't randomly place that pin in. It's 1/4 inch from the raw edge because it's going to indicate where the seam ends up.
It's between the pieces. And this is what's so great about pressing your seams open. I know you might not like to press your seams open, and in which case just ignore this part. You can just think about what you're making for dinner or whatever. Okay, but this is just how we do it. So then if you've pressed the seam open like that, then you can take this pin and you can press it through the other seam perfectly. Do you see how that works? And this is just like, it's something that, it's with this basic skill that people don't ever talk about. The only thing that matters is what happens 1/4 of an inch from the raw edge, because that's where your seam allowance is going, right? So when I see people sometimes at workshops, like they're pinning like that, then I'm thinking like, okay, well, you're not controlling what's happening. And this really matters for things where you really want the seam to align.
When you're trying to match points.
And if that's not of concern to you, then you don't need to do this. But it does answer the question of how do you pin when your seams are pressed open? And that's going to lead to another question that somebody asked about stitch length. Mm-hmm. And they said that when they do this, their seams, when they press open, their seams come apart more easily. So you don't need me to tell you then that maybe you need to shorten your stitch length.
Yeah,
you know?
And this also goes back to the handling.
If it's coming apart.
The handling of the fabrics. If you are sewing pieces together and you find that they're coming apart at the edges after you've pressed, there are a couple things to check. One, is your tension good? on your bobbin and your top tension. Another is, have you just handled them too much? Because of course, if you keep pulling, it wants to come apart. But for us, we're gentle with our fabrics. We pin 1/4 inch away, and we actually use a standard stitch length. We don't shorten it, but it depends on your machine. Every machine really behaves differently.
But I will say, this is a piece, this answers another question. This is a
Actually,
piece.
let's show the front and back so you can really...
So this is the front. This is like 15 years old, but I just found it in our... And this is what it looks like. For the people who say you can't, these are 1/4 inch pieces.
The yellows.
And you can see they just, the seam allowances just overlap each other. So it's just not a big deal at all to do it that way. If you're doing something less than 1/4 inch, then I guess maybe you press one of them to the side. I'm not sure. I've never done anything less than 1/4 inch.
I have, and I just do it to the side.
Yeah. So at any rate, if you're making strip sets with yardage like this, so you're sewing along selvage to selvage cuts, and then you're going to cross cut it. I typically, I don't know whether you do, I typically shorten the stitch length because you're going to have a very small run there if this becomes like a 1 inch strip or something.
I think to build on that, if this is a full width of fabric set that you're cutting into blocks, the fact that you're cutting through does make me like to shorten the stitch length a bit. If I were sewing strips that were this length initially, I wouldn't feel the need to shorten it. But when you're cutting through it, that leaves the edges a little more vulnerable to pulling apart. So that would be a good occasion to shorten your stitch just a tiny bit. I don't shorten it too much because if I make a mistake, it's such a pain to rip out things that are too short.
Yeah.
So it's a trade-off, but definitely, I mean, this brings up the entire question of why are we doing the pressed open seam? And there are multiple reasons. One is if you're trying to match points, if you pin right through the seams and you put your pin in 1/4 inch from the edge and you sew carefully, you're going to have perfectly matching seams or points every time.
Because there's nowhere for it to go.
Yeah, it's just, you know, if you have your seams pressed to the side, the bulk tends to push one piece to the side or the other.
And the presser foot too.
And the presser foot is uneven. So it makes matching seams for us much more straightforward. The other thing it does is the final quilt will be really entirely flat. If I, especially here, if I rub down here, I don't feel the seams because they're not triple thickness being pressed to the side. It's just kind of much more even.
We have had the controversial discussion about pressing seam allowances. Okay, so I also wanted to kind of follow up on this one with a question about sewing long strips so they don't get wonky. So do you want to explain how we alternate sewing directions?
So this came from a strip set, as Week said, where all these strips were originally selvage to selvage, about 42 inches long. And if you sit there and just sew one after another, in most cases, they will tend to bow ever so slightly to the left on most people's machines, partly because the way a sewing machine is, the throat is on the right, and people tend to veer away from it just ever so slightly, subconsciously. Also, I think a lot of people have their workspaces set up with more free area on the left. And I think you just, without even realizing it, kind of push that way. So what we do, rather than sew all the strips in the same direction, we sew pairs in one direction, and then when we put them together, we flip the strip set and sew from the other direction. And you basically get subtle bowing that cancels each other out. And so if you have a half dozen or more long strips to sew together, sew them in pairs, and we mark with chalk which end we started, and then when you put the pairs together, start from the other direction. So chalk is one of the very handy things. We keep inexpensive white school board chalk around all the time to mark either with arrows the direction we've gone or just kind of a line to say which side we started. White chalk, don't use colored school board chalk because it has pigments that can stain, but the white is great, it's cheap, and it washes out.
And the clover also washes out.
Oh, okay. We also the beloved super fine point.
You can't even really see it.
You can't even see the point. It's a tiny, tiny wheel in there, and it has chalk dust that is fortunately refillable. And these come in different colors. They don't stain. They're wonderful. We use them for precision marking. We use school board chalk when it's just kind of like a big arrow or we're numbering pieces.
Yeah. Okay, so the questions keep rolling in.
Okay.
It's a
Weeks is on the.
It's a smorgasbord of questions. Okay, so that is the long strips conversation. Piecing curves, I think that should be a whole other month.
Yes.
But in the meantime, our Bill's YouTube tutorial that was kind of in the days before we were really doing much on YouTube.
I apologize. It's not like super
it's
slick.
casual.
It's very casual, but I did sit down and go through piecing curves on our YouTube channel. I mean, we have an entire class that we teach, so if your guild's interested, just give us a holler.
Yeah.
It goes into a lot more detail, but I love curves.
Also, Modern Quilts Illustrated number 8 also is the curves issue, and there's a ton of step-by-step our method.
So we're not trying to avoid you right now with the curves.
No, but
it's just that's a big one.
That's a whole,
and
that's
we want to be encouraging. We love curves. We want you to sew curves.
Yes, and you can absolutely do it. And we'll have more probably next month about curves.
Yeah, we definitely have more coming up.
Okay, so one of the and then I'm going to try to get through a couple of these little ones because we have some big juicy piecing topics to get to in a minute. Threads for piecing. Okay, we are super frugal, practical people, and people I can already hear the jaws dropping. We piece with leftover bobbins from our long arm, which are the Tex 40, right? Which is thicker than most people
ordinary cotton. And it's funny because I think every month the topic of thread has come up.
Yes.
And in a nutshell, ordinary signature cotton thread is what we use most of the time. Tex 40. Honestly, figure out what works well with your machine and what you're happy with. If you use the more expensive thinner threads for piecing, you fit more on a bobbin. So if you hate running out of bobbin, that's the advantage there. But it's more expensive in most cases.
I also think it's a little harder to rip out.
It's a lot harder to rip out. And can you tell that we rip out things all the time? I mean, I like really good craftsmanship, but that doesn't mean that what you see in the finished quilt is how it was all along. Every now and then you make a mistake, and the Tex 40 is so much easier to get the seam ripper under without accidentally snagging the fabric.
I actually found on my phone yesterday a quilt, the quilt that preceded Old School. We had an entire quilt that we designed and pieced. It was going and rediscovering your stash. It was totally pieced.
It was
100%.
Done.
Or maybe 95% pieced. I saw the picture of it yesterday, and I remembered we totally took that quilt apart. We just decided it was you were going to hate it. It was not going to be fun for you to make. It wasn't fun for us to make.
But here was the problem.
Yeah, but we just
loved the fabrics we'd used, and we used all that we had in our stash. Yeah. So we ripped it all apart. And I remember
we were
picking little threads off each other. After you do a lot of seam ripping, you get the little threads everywhere. But it was well worth it.
Okay, so a couple other little quick ones. Caroline wants to know about pressing right after washing and drying. Okay, so this is my pressing hack for preparing for piecing. We actually have a whole YouTube tutorial on pre-washing and everything, but and it explains the Centerpole and Retain and how to use
bleeding issues,
all that. Basically, we have a little Korean song that plays.
Korean dryer.
Yes, the Korean dryer that says, "Your fabric is ready," you know. And anyway, as soon as we hear that, I don't let it sit there for 3 hours. It's still warm at that point, and the cotton is still malleable when it's warm like that.
And we don't set the dryer. Some dryers have a more dry setting that has a humidistat that just makes sure they're bone dry.
They don't need to be bone dry.
We don't like that because that can set wrinkles. So we just have like ordinary dry.
Yeah. So let's say that it's 5 fat quarters or something. I take them immediately from the dryer and I smooth them all out on the cutting table right here, one on top of another. So they're all flat, and then I take them all, the whole layer of all 5 of them, or 15 of them, or whatever, over to the ironing board, and I press them 5 fat quarters at a time, or whatever it is. And so I'm pressing and steaming them all at once.
Yeah, so we press with steam, even though we've just dried them.
Yeah.
The steam allows you to go through all the layers. And I will also say, we get a little spoiled. We've been working so much with our own fabrics lately, and the Benertex mills, there's something about the fabric that
it's a good gray good.
Really nice gray good. So when you pull it out and smooth it out, it's really smooth. So but we do still press before we cut, and we don't tend to starch anything unless we're using a really loose weave fabric.
So so basically, I think it's easier to handle fabric when it's pressed flat. It takes up less room in storage. Our basic rule is that, see all these bins behind us?
Oh.
Nothing goes in here until it's washed, dried, and pressed. It cannot be put away. So our rule is that, you know, if we have, like we have fabric that we bought in Japan that's still in a box of other fabrics that we haven't used yet, that does not go in here. Okay. That is kept separate, so we're clear about what's washed and what hasn't been washed.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Basically, our cut stash that we have bins and bins of, we know is 100% pre-washed.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Okay, so, you know, I want to circle back to the threads because I realize we didn't say, we use 100% cotton thread. Use whatever works for you in your machine. I like to have all of the thread match the fabric just for kind of wear reasons. But do whatever works for you. And, you know, if things don't work for you, like even if it's stitch length or whether it's pressing open or whatever, again, I want to reiterate that. Did you lose any sleep last night worrying about whether somebody pressed a seam open or not? No, I have not. You do what works for you. We're just here to share with you what we've learned the hard way of making hundreds of quilts.
And we're also open-minded to know that just because we've done one thing for 20 years, we may design a new quilt where we have to have a different technique, and that's fine. So
for an example of this is that on the 2 videos that I have, on Craftsy and iQuilt, I pieced with a walking foot on both of them because the old 1/4-inch foot did not work very well for me. And then it seems like they redesigned the 1/4-inch foot and it worked better. And we started seeing some wear issues with our walking foot. There still are some occasions where I piece with a walking foot.
So actually...
Yeah, go ahead. You can.
So I actually have 3 feet. So your machine will be different. We have, what is it, a 15-year-old Bernina. The walking foot on a Bernina, for those of you who don't use a walking foot, has feed dogs that are kind of rubberized that push the fabric from the top at the exact same rate that the feed dogs push underneath. The walking foot is ideal for fabrics that are slippery. If you're doing garments that have like any slippery fabrics, it really helps. But we, for many, many years, pieced everything with a walking foot. And as Weeks said, things have changed. The wear of these kind of rubberized pads, our old walking foot at one point glazed over and they started to slip. We got a new one, it worked much better. But the 1/4 inch foot, which has a little side guard here that in theory is exactly 1/4 inch. If my fabrics aren't slippery.
It's the COVID shot.
Yes, that's it. Then I actually use the 1/4 inch foot now for piecing much more than I used to. But there are a couple exceptions. This little kind of gate on the side is kind of annoying if I have something with a ton of pins. If I have a really precise piece, even though I always pull the pins out before I get there, the gated foot comes just before the needle. So sometimes it bulks on the pin, tiny little detail, you figure it out.
Yeah.
Plain old #1 foot also works. So I think this goes back to experiment with what works for you. Do I have a side? I don't know how many questions we have.
You can keep going.
Okay,
yeah.
Quick one. The other thing is most machines, not all, but most have different throat plates that you can use. So if I hold up a standard throat plate, and I'm trying to do this so you can see as clearly as possible, the throat plate is where the feed dogs come up, and in the middle there's a horizontal line there. That's where the needle goes into the machine, and it's a horizontal gap, so if you're doing a zigzag, the needle can go back and forth. If you are piecing triangles or anything that has thin points, the disadvantage is sometimes the needle sucks your thin points down into that gap, and that's why a lot of manufacturers make what's called a straight stitch plate. So the straight stitch plate only has one, whoops, I'm trying to do this backwards, one tiny hole that the needle can only go down through. If you try to sew a zigzag stitch with this, it would zigzag, hit the metal, and the needle would go flying. That's why there's a little red warning on this, but honestly, that warning is so small and it's behind everything.
It's under fabric.
It's under fabric. So Weeks and I have something whenever we use a straight stitch plate, which honestly I leave on almost all the time when I'm piecing, we have a little post-it note that says straight stitch, and we put it right over the button on our machine that allows you to turn on the zigzag. So basically you can't turn on the zigzag without moving this. So it's a reminder, hey, the straight stitch plate is on. You need to switch if you're going to go to a zigzag.
Do you remember that Judy Chaffee gave us that switch plate?
One of our
students who's now a friend.
Yeah,
she was a student 21 years ago or whatever.
She saw that we weren't using one of these. It's like, you really need one of these. And so, Judy, thank you.
Yes, we're
still
using it.
You're totally right. We still use it all the time.
Absolutely.
And if your machine doesn't do that, if you don't have a replaceable throat plate, you can actually put a little piece of masking tape and poke a hole in it. And that just acts like a little barrier, and that works for a lot of people.
It does. So Sue Chrysler is asking us for tips for keeping snowball corners on mark. So this is where we have our policy of we don't comment on other people's patterns. And I know that that's a traditional pattern. We can't give you advice on something because we haven't thought it through and we haven't practiced it and we're not really clear on what the issues would be and how the pattern that you're reading or whatever would be.
So I would just say the general comment would be, if the pressing seams open for us is the #1 thing we feel that controls keeping things on point. But I agree with Weeks. Like I haven't sewn a snowball block. So I don't want to give you bad advice.
I guess, maybe I'm just going to give you advice. So, well, I don't know how they're telling you to do it, but I would probably put a full square over a rectangle, chalk the line, sew the line, and then trim and square it up. That's probably how I would end up doing. I have no idea. Yeah, it just sort of, I don't. Yeah, it's somebody else's. We would have to think that through more.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Kristen wants to know our preferred method for flattening a particularly heavy seam juncture, such as a star middle.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so the critical thing with star middles is to trim as you go. So, and I didn't get this question in advance, so I'm not prepared with an example. But basically, when you have a star, let me see if I can kind of make one. You're going to end up having one of those little dog ear, kind of this sort of thing. Trim this off. And so trim off the extra points before you sew them onto the next piece.
And you can still, if you have a really acute angles at the center of a star, let's say you have 8 pieces coming together, and there are some that can be stubborn for sure. One of the things I've done occasionally is I sometimes have a cup of water, dip my finger in it, and I drop a drop of water right on the center so the actual fabric gets wet. And then I iron that down rather than steaming. I literally wet that whole center. It kind of is like, it just relaxes when it's wet, and then I press with the iron. I find that's very different than going in a dry center and steaming. So that's my
I would also quilt, like, make sure that when you're doing the quilting, you go right through that center. You know, and you've got to make sure that your quilt, you've got a walking foot or you're using a long arm or whatever, but you want to thread, and the tension of the machine, if you quilt right through that center, will flatten it more than anything else you can do.
Yeah, so, and this is really good advice, because a lot of times star centers have so much more bulk than any other part of the quilt. And when I look at quilting that people do, it often goes around the center just because it's this lump and it pushes your sewing machine away, especially if you're doing free motion. So as we said, we intentionally aim to quilt right through that, which helps press it down.
For sure.
But without a doubt, that requires a sturdy needle. You don't want, I've actually broken needles on bulky seams. So I slow down.
Grab one more quilt.
Okay, I slow down as I'm going through the bulk. I don't go crazy with free motion through all that bulk because the needle could well break. And also, it depends on your machine. The strength of the needle bar on higher end machines, there's less flex, and they're more likely to just boom, get right through that bulk than some other machines. Oh,
okay.
There's a great one with centers.
Okay, so I think we're into the main course of piecing that people ask me a lot about, and we'll continue to obviously take more questions about this. But I say the most common, I'm interested to hear what you say about this. The most common,
as you can tell, we don't prepare. That like what we're going to say, we just react.
Well, you were getting your COVID shot, and then I got my COVID shot earlier, so I had brain fog. One of the things that I'm asked most about is this basic question of how do you start piecing? And people ask me, like, for scrappy quilts, or for even non-scrappy quilts, like if you have like a whole bunch of K fabrics, or you have just a lot of different prints in one quilt. How do you start piecing? How do you start pairing things up? And so I want to take this opportunity, again, not to crush anybody's quilting dreams.
Just say how we do it.
Just to say how we do it. So there is a theory that you should just blindly piece and not think about that it's all, there's put it all in a bag and you just pull it out. And I always say that works well if somebody with a great color sensibility is putting this stuff in the bag. However, it's a little bit tricky to get your color distribution within a quilt. And I was teaching once at QuiltCon, and we were talking about this, and I was explaining that you've got to be ruthless in editing your palette to begin with, and the YouTube tutorial on palette editing is really, really helpful for that. And we talk about our method for that. But that once you like the palette and you've edited it ruthlessly, then you need to make sure that the color distribution is going to be consistent throughout the quilt, and that you're not going to end up with what I like to call the sharks versus the jets.
And actually, I'd like to be, so this doesn't stay too abstract. I'd like to give an example of what she means. So this is the fabric fusion block quilt, and the basic block has 5 fabrics together. And the way that this is constructed, I mean, this has dozens of fabrics, but it's constructed by having a pair and a pair and a single. So you sew pairs and you attach this to a single. Then you take this block and you attach it to another pair. And what Weeks is talking about is, what is the strategy? Like, how do you determine this pair to begin with?
Because this is, so...
This is a little counterintuitive.
The student was saying, in response to this, she was saying that she had a palette she really liked. But when she started piecing, she would pick, she'd had all of her pieces all laid out.
Pre-cut.
And she would be pairing pieces of, the proper size together. And she was matching, she was pairing fabrics. So she was matching 2 fabrics. Each time she put it through the sewing machine, she was making sure that those fabrics looked good together.
So she might have said, oh, I want to put this red and this orange together because they're kind of similar. And what that would do is create a big red-orange chunk.
But what she said was she was making a queen-size quilt. Oh. And she said, but within a couple of hours, I had 2 different quilts and 5.5 yards of ugly. I remember this, 5.5 yards of fabric that didn't work together. And basically she had made 2 quilts.
She had started grouping things without thinking of the whole. So in this case, when we made this, we picked 2 fabrics that we knew looked great in the overall palette. But if you were just going to pick 2, they might not necessarily be the ones that you'd first put together.
No. Categorically horrible. Like, horrible together. Like, these 2, you would not want them together.
Especially like if you were making a 2-color quilt, these wouldn't be the 2 that you'd pick.
You would not put these together. You would not put these together.
But collectively...
because you're committing to the whole palette at this point. And so, for example...
Well, I was going to say, like...
See, this is the meat and potatoes here.
People often think, I make a bunch of blocks, then I lay out the blocks, and I get the distribution at that point. What we're encouraging is, especially with Scrappy quilts that have a block structure, is aim for distribution within each block so that all the blocks are different. And then that makes the final layout where you have to put the blocks all around so much easier.
So, for example, a lot of quilts with K-facets fabrics
Like our Go Big quilt.
are, you'll see people, a lot of people, what I've seen them do is pair the pinks together, and then they'll make like a pink block, and then they'll make a green and blue block, and that's a totally different quilt.
It is, because you have...
Then you get a checkerboard.
You see the structure of the blocks more. Here we wanted the structure to be this white diagonal,
Right.
but have a varied distribution of all the fabrics. So it's, you get very different results depending on how you make those initial pairings. So just think about the initial pairings.
But think, like, commit to the palette, and then be confident that the way they all looked together on the cutting table will look the same way in the quilt, even if the pairings, like, this is so horrible together. You know, if you just see these two together.
I actually like them, but.
Well, but they don't match in any way.
Yeah.
You would not normally put them together. And this is one of those basic, like, look at this yarn, this Marcia Dursey and this, like, really kind of Civil War
Frumpy yarn dye.
You know.
Unlikely bedfellows.
Right, but that's the way, that's the best way to get color distribution, because otherwise you'll end up with 2 different quilts and 5.5 yards of ugly.
And
you know?
we always see, like, if there are fabrics that look good in the overall palette, but you don't personally like them, make sure to use them equally early on, because if you just kind of avoid them, they are not going to get in the quilt. They'll end up being a whole bunch at the end that...
So Cindy is saying, or Candy is saying that, but there's scale of the pattern too. Ugh, I'm so OCD. Yes,
Okay, so
violate the scale.
Look how
because
big,
you're committing to the overall palette.
Yeah, this is a fussy, teeny tiny print, and this is an
Amy
enormous Amy Butler.
Yeah.
But
or also there's this one. Hold on.
There we
This
go.
one too. There's one of the Cafe lotus leaves with this little small scale print. That's what you want, because otherwise you're going to have...
If you want that, like, that's... You could,
But if you're making
if
a
it drives you
quilt.
crazy, you could have a quilt that has all the fabrics in the same size. But this fabric fusion pattern, what we loved about it is we could mix color, hue, saturation, scale, fabric genre. So for us, this was about intentionally mixing it up. So we did intentionally pair a large scale with a small scale right away, so that we didn't end up with some blocks that were all small scale, some blocks that were all large scale.
Yeah, because if you don't mix them in those initial pairings,
You got problems later.
then you've got the small scale quilt and you've got the large scale quilt.
But if that's kind of anxiety provoking, just don't do that. I mean, make a different style of quilt.
Well, then scrappy quilts aren't the
Necessarily.
genre for
Yeah.
you.
And there's
Okay,
nothing wrong
so
with that.
the name of this quilt pattern, this is Fabric Fusion,
Fabric Fusion.
and this is Go Big. I think
And
those are the ones
Fabric
you're asking about.
Fusion is a standalone pattern on our pattern page of our site.
And
we have made this, I mean, this is so versatile. I've seen
so many
dozens
versions
and
of it.
dozens and dozens of
I've
versions.
seen like Halloween versions and Christmas versions, and it's fun.
And bright versions and...
Go Big is in Rediscovering Your Stash.
Right.
So, okay. So then once, let's just say you're doing either of these quilts that both use a lot of different prints. You've taken that first step of distributing your colors intentionally. So, actually, hold on, I'm going to back up. So, I would say, for me, the whole intuitive thing, if they're all blue, they're all navy blue fabrics, for
A quilt
example,
like this with, say, 26 navy blues.
then sure.
You don't have to overthink it.
Then just pair them randomly, because they're going to look similar
No matter what.
at the end of the day. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to this, but this is super important in piecing, I think.
It is. But yeah, when you're going for variety, you have to be more intentional about how you go about it. Because when there's variety, some items, some fabrics may stand out more than others, and that's why you really want to keep the distribution good.
So then you're going to make your blocks And then you got to lay out the blocks and make sure that you don't have what we call adjacency issues. So, for example, this striped fabric here, you don't want one above it that's also striped. You don't want one here, and one here. You don't want any unintentional lines, patterns that are created by repeating a fabric in some sort of way that it lines up.
Yeah, because what can often happen is that becomes more dominant when you look at the quilt than, in this case, we wanted that white to be the dominant item. And if you had 5 polka dot fabrics in the same row, your eye is going to spot the similarities. Our brains are really, really good at spotting patterns. And so you, as the quilter, have to be in control of what patterns you see and what you don't.
I think it's also that you want your piecing to look intentional.
Yeah.
And that if there's a row of fabrics or there's some sort of angle, then it looks like you're trying to draw the eye to one particular area for one particular reason.
And it might not be the intention.
Right. So if they're all in the same role within the quilt, then they should all be distributed kind of equally well.
I'm looking really quickly.
Yes.
Beverly talked about having some really fine pins that help, avoiding the bulk if you're sewing. I agree. I actually love the clover flower head pins. For me, they are the right balance between...
I'm guessing she's talking about thinner than those.
Yeah, there actually are ones that are thinner.
Yeah.
But these are thinner than a lot of others. So yeah, experiment.
It depends on what works for you. I've used some of the other thinner ones, and to me they're too thin, and then they won't go through all of the layers. So it's just,
or they bend.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They bend.
We had one box of really thin flower head. They were a different brand, and I didn't tell you, but I threw them all out because they were
that checks out.
Whereas, like, I actually have here some kind of traditional the glass head pins, and I don't use, these are too thick for me. And I only use them for kind of pinning palettes together.
Well, actually, I think this is useful for if you're doing zippers or garment sewing.
Yeah.
What you're working with vinyl or whatever. These are the clover pins. Though,
I
right?
think we have 5 different magnetic pin cushions sitting around, and someone who mentioned in the chat that they were OCD with fabric layout. Are you like me? That every now and then I sit there and I turn.
No, we're not like you, Bill.
Pins,
we're not like
so
you.
All the heads are on the same direction.
And my whole feeling is the whole point of these pin cushions is that they don't move. And
we're all a little different.
Yes, we're all a little different.
Okay.
So, and speaking of which,
you go.
We got these from Schmetz Needles, who makes these Grabbit pin cushions
and mini ones.
Yes, too. And we love the Schmetz Needles over there. Also,
so again, we have no gig with them.
Yeah, we have no gig.
There was in the chat, there was a question about what needles do we use for piecing, and I've referred to this before. If I were coordinated and 6'8" and had a college scholarship to play basketball, I would get free basketball shoes. I don't have any of those talents. Instead, I get free needles.
We're getting free needles.
So I don't.
We need to report that to the IRS.
I don't think I've bought needles in a long time, but I'll be honest that we have needles that we bought 20 years ago, so we have a lot of needles. I think the biggest thing with piecing is replace your needles frequently. If you don't, what will happen is if you get a tiny burr on the end of your needle, which happens if you hit a pin or sometimes even just through wear, that burr pushes the cotton down into the bobbin area and you get a lot more dust. And you're more likely to have tension problems or skipping. So in an effort to keep our machine clean, we always check and replace the needles. So in terms of what needle do we use for piecing, okay, universal needles. I'm sorry, I'm not a needle snob.
Can you hold it closer so I can see the measurement?
These are the Schmetz Universal. The chrome is their latest high-end that are supposed to be longer lasting. I don't sit there and figure out, do they last longer? All I can say is they've been fantastic. And so these are 80-12. The thickness of the needle refers to, like, if you have Microtex, a sharp, it's much thinner. If you have the quilting versus the piecing needle, the quilting needle is a little thinner. I'll fess up, I don't notice a huge difference. They all work really well for me.
Microtex is really great if you're doing a very, very fine, like if you're doing chiffon or something like really delicate.
And the needle matters.
You would notice a difference.
In garment sewing, the needle matters because you don't want to sew a knit with a sharp. You want a ballpoint, a rounded one, so it doesn't snag the knit.
But you don't want to use a ballpoint needle for quilting. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I wanted to get to Christine's question about stash. She says she's a relatively new quilter, doesn't have a stash. What is the minimum number of fabrics needed to make a scrappy quilt? Depends on the pattern is the answer to that. So, there are people who write patterns for 60 fabrics, and there are people who will write scrappy patterns for 16. So it's all just sort of depends on...
I can give you a ballpark, though, just from experience. As Week says, it depends on the pattern you're dealing with. But if you're really going for a scrappy look, I have found that if you have fewer than, say, 16 fabrics, especially if you have blocks, when you lay them out, you're going to start to get some repetitions that look not very scrappy. So, like, if you have 16 or more, it will certainly make the layout better. But if you're really going for scrappy, more is more.
And more is easier, but the other thing, though, is that realize, especially if you're a new quilter, that when we write patterns, the default, the kind of lowest common denominator is to say 16 fat quarters or 24 fat quarters. The honest truth is that it doesn't matter whether it's the equivalent of 16 fat quarters.
If we say 16 fat quarters.
Yeah, let's just say it's 6 or 24 fat quarters or whatever. You don't have to have equal numbers, especially in a scrappy quilt. You don't have to have equal numbers of this size block appear in the quilt from this fabric. So you probably, unless you're making a specific charm quilt or something in which each fabric only appears one time, most of the time, no one will notice, if you have a large number of fabrics, say over 20, nobody's going to notice if this appears 3 times or 4 times.
And there are reasons you may want fewer.
Yeah.
Like this beautiful Marcia Dursey print here is fantastic, but we intentionally used it just in the medium and the small sizes just because it is more saturated than many of the others. So we didn't use it in lots of, I don't know if we used it at all, but certainly not in many of the large pieces because we thought it would stand out too much. So those are these individual kind of art directions.
Okay, and so the last thing is we're going to talk about our new publication. Do you want to talk about it? You want to introduce it?
Well, let me start with,
okay.
We've been really thrilled with the success over the years of our Fat Quarter Love series, where we have 1, 2, and 3, and each of these has, what's so cool is it's the size of the actual folded fat quarter, and it had a whole series of fat quarter friendly patterns that weren't dependent on any one fabric. And we have printed these over and over, and so Weeks and I think all the time about you, the quilter, and we want to know, like, what do you have in your stash? What kinds of quilts do you want to make? And one of the things, if you've been to a quilt show lately, I guarantee you have seen the trend of pixel quilts.
They're these little tiny quilts that are they're made with little tiny
often
pieces.
Like a little 2-inch square.
Yeah, so we decided to do these little patterns
so
for pixel quilts.
We did.
So this is the size of a pixel.
This is the size of the fat
and
quarter.
The print is a little tiny. So you'll need a magnifying glass to read it, but it will get you a pixel quilt.
And so this is Fat Quarter Love.
Yeah.
So
this is
Pixel Love has the whole series, and we decided, like, I know this isn't what we usually do, but people are doing really
teeny
tiny little rainbows, little hearts. And we even have the directions for how to take a photo you have of yourself, because this is one of the most common is the pixel portrait quilt.
Yeah. So you may need a magnifying glass to read. Can you open up to the patterns?
Okay.
Because it's so
even
tiny.
The introduction.
Yeah, even the introduction. You'll need the magnifying glass to see it.
But we wanted to keep it true to the spirit that these were so successful. And I really like the fact that it matches what you're making. You're so aware of it. So.
And what is the publication date on it?
It is April 1st.
April Fools!
Oh, we had so much fun doing this, and I hope no one thought we were for real. And obviously, Robbie, you were on to us here. But I don't know whether
so Bill was up till 11 o'clock at night.
Is the size the giveaway, or is it the fact that I don't think we've ever done a rainbow quilt, although it is kind of sweet. But I had so much fun making this, because who doesn't like something small? And I actually said to Weeks, you know what, you could really do this.
I said it has to be small enough that people aren't really going to go to our website to try to order it.
So yes, April Fools and pixel quilts are charming.
Yes.
Not going to do a pixel quilt publication.
Okay.
And yes, these are real.
So we will, it's already, we've already up to an hour. We will, oh good, we got a couple of people, that's funny.
Good.
You really sold it, Bill, Susan.
Yay! And you know what else? So I was thinking, the other great thing if we did this, shipping would be so inexpensive.
Okay, so we will answer more questions on May 1st.
Yeah, time flies.
Time is flying.
And I hope we got to as many of your questions as we can.
Yeah.
Weeks is so good about... I've got the bad eyes, and I can't read the screen easily from a distance, so she's on it. So if we missed it, I'm blaming her.
Well, we can't always get to them, but I think we try, and we will keep taking. We'll pace ourselves, and if there's enough other questions, maybe we'll have a kind of roundup toward the end of the year of all.
So it always helps to have your questions ahead of time too, and we can prepare. But we hope you have a wonderful spring here, and we've got glorious sun here.
And we hope
Chicago.
Those of you who are able to get immunized can do so and continue wearing those masks. Where the numbers are going up, and we're going to try to avoid that fourth wave here in the U.S. I know it's really bad in Europe right now.
I just sent my sister a happy birthday. She was born on April Fool's Day, and she lives in France, so they just went into another lockdown.
Oh, Margaret said she was ready to order Pixel.
So anyway. Well, for you, Margaret, $1,000.
Oh, she said, I tuned out on the pixel quilts as soon as you said you needed the magnifying glass. Well, it was a joke. Okay, well, thank you so much. Yes, and Robbie and all of those of you who celebrate Easter. Happy Easter, and we'll see you next month, if not before.
Nice to see you.
Take care, and thanks for all your comments and questions. We'll see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Oh, and this will be on YouTube later if you just came in at the end and missed any.